Hello everyone, it's Rob Watson, the module leader for TECH2503 Community Media Production. This is a short overview of the topics that we're going to cover in this week's lecture, which is entitled What is Community Development? And we talked last week about some of the kind of maybe slightly depressing challenges that your generation is facing in terms of how we move forward with a community. How do we support a more sustainable approach to our communities, and something which feels more kind of engaged and participative, and which has a kind of an integrity to it, which isn't just reduced to blunt market forces, or kind of a separation and segregation and kind of anxiety and all those kind of negative issues which seems to fuel a kind of a lot of kind of angst in society these days. So what is the role that community media can play, and how do we think about community media really as a community development practice? Because whilst we're learning about media and we're learning to produce media, it's not. It's only a tool. It's a way to bring people together. It's a mechanism that we can use to mediate our experiences based around the idea it has a purpose. It has a social use. It isn't. We don't just look at it in its own right as if it's kind of somehow unique and it isn't touched by the context of social practice. But if in fact it's something which is embedded in social practice and born from social practice, and is something which we change and move forward, and we can use to develop our sense of community through our social practices. So the idea for this lecture is to talk through some of the issues. I've produced the PowerPoint presentations, but as ever I don't share the PowerPoint presentations because there's clips and images, and it's just images, it's just PowerPoint. PowerPoint's boring. So the notes, okay, these notes are pretty boring, they're written notes, but it's all the information that you need, and if there's any links and diagrams that are essential, they're in these notes as well, so it's easier for you to assimilate what's been said. What are the challenges then of community development? I think there's a kind of a number of factors that we need to be considering. One is kind of the idea of social change. Often almost we think about kind of society as being fairly static, and the change that, how do we account for the change that happens in society? What do we look to that kind of indicates or shows us that things are changing, either for the worse or for the better? And I suppose in a way one of the the kind of pavement politics is a phrase that used to kind of have a lot of resonance in certain political debates, because it's kind of when you might live in a neighbourhood that starts to look unkempt and tatty, and there's litter and there's broken windows, and all of a sudden that area can have a very negative kind of, and people move out, and you get what's called middle class white flight from those areas, and it becomes a kind of an urban ghetto of an itinerant population that is kind of poor. And there's a whole kind of load of studies about New York in the 1970s, and I think it's kind of urban development in the UK. It's kind of, we've not invested in our cities. It's kind of we the actual, as living spaces, as communities, they're fairly poor in my experience. So what are the things that we look to? And there's an example, a video that we can look at, which is kind of about Braunston in Leicester, which is a really kind of interesting clip, kind of blast. It's from 1986, and it's kind of a blast from the past, if you like, of how approaches to community development have kind of really kind of changed our ideas of what is acceptable and what's socially acceptable and what isn't. But I want to underpin this with some thinking in terms of different ways that we can think about this, because if we have an analytical framework, I don't like using the word theoretical framework, because it just sounds too kind of abstract, if you like, whereas analytical suggests that it's something that we're using purposefully as a set of tools. But that's what theories are. They're tools to help our thinking. So I'm quite pragmatic about these things. So what we'll look at is some pragmatic ideas about social change and about the basis on which things are accounted for as they change, which kind of ground them in experience. The pragmatic tradition asks the question, what's the difference that makes the difference? And if it doesn't make any difference, why are we following in that? And that is applicable to theories and ideas and analytical tools as much as as it is to practical issues as well. So we'll look at some of the kind of pragmatic stories that we can think about in order to account for the kind of the stories we tell about change and about development. So we'll look at kind of ways of thinking about this, the kind of resources that communities have, the kind of resilience, the kind of mobilization that communities need in order to be able to account for change. Justice, social justice is a big key issue. We often reduce these things to kind of thinking about in terms of systems and input and output, and within the center there's a process going on. And is that really applicable to social and community life, or is something else going on? And there's other alternative approaches which are kind of like, the kind of self-help paradigm of kind of, the kind of almost the kind of social Darwinism, where you kind of have to look after yourself, and following that, the Thatcherism was very much, there's no such thing as society, that kind of argument. And how does this inform policy approaches? How does this inform the way in which resources and access to resources, and who gets heard by local authorities and planning applications, and who doesn't, the kind of free market approach to these things, and how does this work in practice? So there's a fair amount to conceptually to think about with this, but I think it's really important that we lay some groundwork to kind of mapping out some of these ideas that will then help us to make more informed choices when we undertake our community development practices. So when you're putting together your community media cafe, is that you're doing it on the basis that is well informed, and you can make choices, you can consider alternatives, and you say, well, if we adopt this kind of point of view at this stage, that means that later on we're going to have to account for this in this particular way. But if we tweak that and change it and maybe come at it from a different angle, there's a phrase I'll use a lot because it's a good phrase. If you only give people hammers, all your problems only ever look like nails. And our problems aren't nails. There's a wide variety of problems, and we need lots of different types of tools and different perspectives to deal with our problems. We need to be pluralistic about our approaches to problem solving. If we just stick to using hammers and nails, well, we're not going to make much. We might make IKEA wardrobes, and that's about it. So anyway, I'm going off on a tangent. So the notes are up online, wiki.our.dmu.ac.uk. If you've got any comments, if you want to ask any questions, if you want to share any media, please feel free to jump in on the discussion forum. That's talk.our.dmu.ac.uk. There's a TECH2502 thread. Otherwise, start your own thread, start your own discussion about something. But I'll see you at the lecture next week.